I must confess, before that autumn visit to the village of Belfry-on-the-Weald, I had been enjoying a period of remarkable tranquility. Hercule Poirot, my dear friend of many years, had declared that the English countryside was the very picture of order, and so he had chosen to lodge there for several weeks. I accompanied him, partly for companionship, and partly out of fond nostalgia for our past adventures. Yet, as so often happens where Poirot goes, the tranquility would not endure. Belfry-on-the-Weald was the sort of village one imagines on a postcard. Stone cottages with climbing roses, a narrow green common where old men played chess, and at its heart, the ancient Clocktower, a square, weathered structure, rising above the tiled rooftops like a solemn, ever-watchful sentinel. The clock-tower told the hours with pleasing regularity, though villagers would sometimes remark, in a tone nearly superstitious, that there were certain hours the bell should never strike. When pressed on the meaning, they would shrug or laugh or quietly change the subject. Rural whimsy, I thought. Poirot merely raised an eyebrow the first time he heard it mentioned. Superstition, he murmured to me, the charming refuge of idle minds. It was on our 6th evening in the village that the tranquility shattered. The Belfry Ladies' Historical Society had arranged a small exhibition in the church hall, displaying various local artifacts. Poirot and I attended at the invitation of Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, a dignified spinster whose family had resided in the village for generations. She led tours with a practiced grace, her voice even and pleasant, until, quite suddenly, the clock-tower bell tolled. It rang once, then again, and again. Not the pleasant hour mark, but 6 slow, heavy strikes. 6 o'clock had passed nearly 40 minutes earlier. There was a hush. I had the queer sensation that every person in the room was holding their breath. Miss Whitcomb paled, though she tried to recover herself. "It is nothing," she said lightly. "The mechanism is old. It misstrikes from time to time." The villagers did not look convinced. Then, just as the final echo faded, we heard the scream. It came from outside, from the direction of the clock tower. Poirot was already moving. I hurried after him, as did several others. The evening air was crisp. Fallen leaves scraped underfoot as we rushed across the common. Lanterns and electric bulbs cast long, strange shadows against the tower's stone base. The door to the clock tower stood open. Inside, the steps spiraled steeply upward, and at the foot of them stood Reverend Alistair Penn, white as plaster, one trembling hand raised to his mouth. "Up there," he whispered, "on the landing." Poirot did not hesitate. He climbed quickly, though with his usual caution of foot placement, of course, while I followed. Halfway up, a gallery opened toward the great bronze bell, and there, lying upon the cold wooden planks, was a man's body. Arthur Selby, a solicitor from London, recently arrived in the village to assist with several disputed inheritances, and not, I thought, particularly well loved for his fastidious and somewhat superior manner. He now lay quite still, his limbs arranged unnaturally, his eyes open and unseeing. Beneath him, a thin thread of dark blood trickled between the boards. No weapon lay in sight. Poirot knelt, not touching the body, and surveyed the scene with that expression I'd come to know. Quiet, deep, and disturbingly serene thoughtfulness. "Mon ami," he murmured, "observe." "What is it?" I asked. "The hands," he said. "They're clean." I blinked. Should they not be? Poirot did not reply directly. Instead, he slowly pointed upward to the bell. There was a cord attached to it, thick, heavy, and frayed near the end. It appeared to have been cut. Someone had severed the bell rope. To what end, I could not yet imagine. We heard steps on the stairs. 3 figures arrived in rapid succession. Miss Whitcomb, her nephew James Whitcomb, a tall, thin young man with spectacles and a nervous air, and Mrs. Millicent Gray, a widow of considerable wealth and equally considerable reputation. Their faces reflected shock, horror, even fear, but not, I thought, surprise. Poirot rose. His voice was gentle, but crisp. Monsieur Selby is dead. He did not fall by accident. Someone here was with him very shortly before the bell rang. He paused, surveying their pale features one by one. Tell me, mesdames et messieurs, who last saw Arthur Selby alive? A long silence followed. Then, quite suddenly, Mrs. Gray spoke, her voice trembling yet determined. I did, she said, only minutes before the bell rang. Poirot's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. Bon, then we shall begin. He looked not at the body, nor the strange cut rope, but at the faces gathered around him. For Hercule Poirot knew already. The truth would not be found in the tower, but in the hearts of those who stood before him. Word of Arthur Selby's death spread through Belfry on the Weald at a speed that belied the village's quiet appearance. By the next morning, the Clocktower stood cordoned off, and the villagers spoke in tight whispers near the bakery and post office. Some speculated about an accident. Others murmured of the bell, of the 6 strikes that should not have rung. But Hercule Poirot had already dismissed the notion of accident. There is the arrangement of the limbs, the absence of dust upon his hands, the cut rope, he said to me over breakfast. Non, Hastings. Someone was with him. Someone wished his death to appear either tragic or mysterious, or both. We had taken rooms at the Rose and Heather Inn, a comfortable establishment run by Mrs. Flora Creswick, a stout, efficient woman with round spectacles and a brisk manner. It was in her sitting room that Poirot arranged a gathering of all principal persons connected with the deceased. They arrived one by one, each revealing something in the way they crossed the threshold. Mrs. Millicent Gray, the widow who had been the last to see Selby alive, wore a deep burgundy coat and gloves too elegant for the occasion. Her eyes were sharp, restless. She clutched her handbag as though it contained something vital. Her late husband had been a shipping magnate. Her fortune was spoken of in cautious tones. Behind her came Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, dignified and reserved. She held herself with the poise of old English gentility. Her family, as we had learned, owned much of the land around the village, including some property disputed in recent inheritance negotiations. James Whitcomb followed, Eleanor's nephew. His spectacles were smudged, his hands fidgeted constantly. He was a solicitor's assistant, working under Selby in the matter of the inheritance review. He did not meet anyone's eye. Beside him entered Reverend Alistair Penn, tall, grave, kindly, yet there was a flicker of something uneasy behind his calm expression. It had been he who first found the body. He took a seat nearest the window, folding his hands as though in silent prayer. And finally, Colonel Rupert Ashworth, retired cavalry officer, moustached and sun-browned, with the air of a man who disapproves of mystery on principle. He greeted Poirot with a stiff nod, muttered something about infernal business, and sat heavily. Poirot remained standing. Mes amis, he began, thank you for joining us. I ask for your patience, your clarity, and your honesty as we consider the death of Monsieur Arthur Selby. We all know it was a fall, Colonel Ashworth interrupted. Tragic, but falls happen. Those stairs are narrow, slippery with age. Poirot made a small, polite gesture with one hand. A fall, perhaps. But consider, the rope to the bell was cut. Someone was present at the time, and the bell itself struck the 6 times. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. No one spoke. Poirot continued. We shall take matters simply. I will ask each of you to describe your movements yesterday evening, between the half-hour past 6 and the strike of 7. Mrs. Gray spoke first, as though eager to assert herself. Mr. Selby came to speak with me, she said, privately. I imagine you all know he was reviewing the will of my late husband's business partner. There was a dispute over certain shares. Her fingers tightened around her handbag. The matter was nearly settled. Arthur, Mr. Selby, wanted to show me a document. I was late arriving to the church hall. We parted at the base of the clock tower. I went inside. That is all. Poirot tilted his head slightly. You parted amicably? She hesitated. I would not say amicably, Monsieur Poirot. Merci? He turned to Miss Whitcomb. Eleanor's face remained composed. I was preparing the final displays for the exhibition. I never saw Mr. Selby last evening. Her nephew tugged at his collar. I left early, he stammered. Mr. Selby had been critical of my work. I thought it best to avoid him for the remainder of the evening. Poirot gave him a long, level look. And where did you go, Monsieur Whitcomb? Home, I read. Poirot did not comment. But I, who had seen Poirot's look many times before, knew the answer did not satisfy him. The Reverend Penn spoke softly. I was preparing the evening psalter. The clock tower door is nearly always locked. I heard a noise and went to investigate only when the bell struck. I found him already gone. Poirot nodded, thoughtful. And you, Colonel? Walking, the Colonel replied. I take constitutional walks at dusk. I heard the bell, thought it odd, came at once. Poirot clasped his hands. Bien. Now we have the outline of events. Silence fell, dense, fragile. Poirot allowed it to stretch, watching each face carefully. Then he smiled, calm, courteous, and faintly amused. There is one more thing. All eyes lifted. When Monsieur Selby was found, his hands were free of dust. The stairs and bell platform are coated with it. If he had climbed, fallen, struggled, there would be dust on his palms. Yet there was none. The Colonel frowned. Meaning? Poirot's voice was soft. He did not climb the steps. A collective intake of breath. He was placed there. A shudder passed through James Whitcomb. Mrs. Gray swallowed. Miss Whitcomb's expression finally cracked, just slightly. The Reverend's gaze lowered. Poirot straightened his cuffs. And now, mes amis, we may begin the real investigation. Poirot insisted we begin immediately, while emotions remained unsettled and memories unpolished. He believed that truth slips most readily from lips still shaken. We were given use of the Rose and Heather Inn's private morning room, a cozy space with floral wallpaper, a polished mahogany table, and a single large window that let in a gentle, pale light. Poirot positioned himself in the center, not behind a desk but before the suspects, as though welcoming conversation rather than extracting it. Human beings, Hastings, he murmured to me as he arranged a vase of dahlias to his satisfaction, are rarely clever in the moment after shock. Observe, and you shall see everything. The first to be interviewed was Mrs. Millicent Gray. She seated herself with poise, though her fingers kept brushing her collar as though some invisible thread irritated her. Madame, Poirot began, folding his hands, you say you parted from Monsieur Selby at the base of the clock tower. Can you recall your conversation exactly? Her jaw tightened. He had changed something in the document, something I did not approve. What was the nature of this change? A clause, she said too quickly. Nothing material. Poirot's eyebrows lifted, the faintest indication that the lie had been catalogued. And your husband's partner, Mr. Calder, when he passed, the ownership of several warehouse stocks remained unspecified. Monsieur Selby sought, I think, to determine their proper beneficiary. Yes, she said stiffly, and he believed they should go to Calder's nephew. I disagreed. You believed they belonged to you. Mrs. Gray's silence confirmed it. Poirot leaned forward. And so, perhaps, did Monsieur Selby. She stiffened. You are implying nothing. I was angry, but I am not a murderer. Poirot smiled pleasantly. Anger, madame, is never reason enough. It is only fuel. One must look for the spark. She stood, chin lifted. I have nothing more to say. Poirot allowed her to leave. Next came Miss Eleanor Whitcomb. Unlike Mrs. Gray, she appeared composed, too composed, perhaps, a dignity that had been trained and perfected over years of social discipline. "Miss Whitcomb," Poirot said gently, "you are a woman who values order, tradition, continuity. The inheritance disputes, they touch your family deeply, do they not?" Her expression did not flicker. "Yes." Arthur Selby was reviewing old claims. "Our family estate is old. Boundaries, tenancies, even rights to certain woodlands. These have been matters of debate over generations. And Monsieur Selby's findings, were they in your favor?" She hesitated, just barely. But Poirot saw. No, they were not. And yet, Monsieur Poirot, I am not a woman who resorts to violence. I prefer to negotiate with patience and dignity. Poirot regarded her with a warmth that was almost kind. "I believe you, but others, perhaps, are less patient." Her eyes flicked just once to her nephew, seated at the far wall. Poirot noted it. "Merci, mademoiselle. That is all." James Whitcomb entered already sweating. He sat, fingers twisting tightly in his lap. "Monsieur," Poirot said softly, "you worked closely with the deceased. Did you like him?" A miserable silence. "No," James whispered. He was impossible. He belittled me, corrected every word, treated me like a child." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "And yet you remained." "I needed the reference," James muttered. "I need this position. I have debts." "Debts are a powerful motivator," Poirot observed. "Monsieur Whitcomb, where precisely were you after leaving the exhibition?" "I told you. I went home to read." Poirot did not move, did not change expression, but the air changed. "And what did you read?" James blinked rapidly. What do you mean?" "The title, monsieur, of the book you read." His mouth opened, closed. His voice failed him. Poirot did not need to raise his voice. "You did not go home." James's hands shook violently. I walked. I did not want to see Selby again, that is all." A half-truth. A weak one. Poirot filed it away like placing a book precisely upon its shelf. "You may go." Reverend Alistair Penn was next. He entered quietly, his hands clasped, his expression pained. "Reverend," Poirot began, "you discovered the body, but I suspect you know more than you say." The Reverend closed his eyes. "I know only that the dead deserve dignity, and Arthur Selby, whatever his flaws, was his soul troubled." "Troubled how?" Reverend Penn hesitated. "He was unsettled. He had become convinced that someone in the village hated him, that he had uncovered something he should not have." Poirot leaned forward sharply. "What had he uncovered?" "I do not know," the Reverend said quietly. "But I urged him to leave Belfry on the Weald. He refused." "He refused because he believed he was close to proving something," Poirot murmured. "Yes. And now he is dead." The Reverend bowed his head. Poirot watched him leave with deep contemplation. The final interview was Colonel Ashworth. He sat like a storm cloud, silent, irritated, restless. "You dislike intrigue, Colonel," Poirot began. "Hate it," the Colonel replied. "You knew Selby? Well enough. Sharp. Too sharp. The sort of man who believes facts are weapons. And you, Colonel, are no man to be threatened." Their eyes met. For the first time, something like respect passed between them. "No," the Colonel said, "I'm not." But he did not deny the threat. Poirot stood, signaling the end. "Hastings," he said, once the suspects had left, "the motive is not anger alone, nor greed alone. It is something that ties these people together, something buried, something real." He turned toward the window. "And we must find what Monsieur Selby discovered before the murderer decides to kill again." The village awoke the next day with a change in its atmosphere. no longer merely hushed, but watchful. People nodded less, lingered less, and eyed the clock tower as one might a sleeping wolf. Mrs. Creswick brought us breakfast on a silver tray, but said not a word while placing it. Even Hastings noticed. "Everyone's waiting," I remarked, stirring my tea. "They all expect you to name the culprit already." Poirot gave a small, satisfied smile. "Mais oui, Hastings. And that impatience," he tapped his temple, "reveals much." He had not yet said what he saw, what shape the truth was beginning to take. I recognized this phase, Poirot gathering the scattered petals of suspicion into a bouquet of logic. But the bloom was not yet complete. We were interrupted by a knock. Mrs. Creswick reappeared, cheeks pink, hands clasped in an anxious knot. "Mr. Poirot, Inspector Durley has arrived. He wishes to speak with you. He seems convinced of something." Poirot exchanged a look with me. "Let us greet the inspector." Inspector Lionel Durley of County Constabulary was a burly, red-faced man who disliked complications and detested mysteries. He stood in the sitting room like a man who believed himself moments away from triumph. "Poirot," he said, dispensing with courtesy altogether, "I believe we've no need to continue your interviews or theories or—" He gestured vaguely. "Foreign methods." Poirot blinked once. "Foreign, Inspector." Durley flushed. "I mean unnecessary methods." "Ah, très bien. And tell me, what makes you so certain the case is solved?" Durley lifted his chin. "We've arrested James Whitcomb." My reaction must have been visible, because Poirot gave me a quiet, warning look. Observe before reacting. Durley continued, triumphant. "He was seen near the clock tower last night. A witness, a reliable one, states Whitcomb approached the tower after the exhibition ended. That contradicts his own account and suggests opportunity." Poirot folded his hands. "Go on." "And," Durley added, clearly savoring the reveal, "we found this." He reached into a brown paper evidence envelope and withdrew a small clasp knife, the blade stained with something dark. "Dried blood," Durley said. "Lab will confirm." Even I felt a small jolt of shock. "So he was involved?" Poirot raised a hand, gently quieting me. "And where was this knife found, Inspector?" "In his desk drawer at the Whitcomb household," Durley said confidently. "Hidden beneath account ledgers." Poirot nodded slowly. "I see. To the untrained eye, this would appear devastating. Motive, resentment, humiliation, financial pressure. Opportunity, seen near the tower. Means, the knife." Durley leaned back, arms folded. "I'll be taking him to the county jail shortly. Thought I'd allow you the courtesy of hearing it from me first." "Inspector," Poirot said politely, "you have done excellent work, but I fear you have arrested the wrong man." Durley sputtered. "What? On what basis?" Poirot approached him, not aggressively, but with quiet certainty. "James Whitcomb is incapable of murder." Durley scoffed. "Ridiculous. Murderers don't wear signs on their hats." "No. They show signs in their behavior. Monsieur Whitcomb avoided Selby. He wished to escape conflict. A man who fears confrontation does not commit murder in a location of such height, difficulty, and risk. And," Poirot pointed at the knife, "that knife is far too convenient." Durley frowned. "Convenient?" Poirot's tone sharpened, elegantly. "A murderer who wishes to conceal his crime does not leave the weapon covered in blood. A murderer who wishes to frame another does precisely that." Durley's mouth opened, closed. "And there is another detail," Poirot said softly. "The rope to the bell. It was cut by someone with precision. That knife," he gestured, "is dull, its blade uneven. The cut rope was clean." The inspector's face purpled. "You are telling me," he growled, "that this knife was planted?" Poirot nodded once. Durley cursed under his breath. "So you suggest we release him?" No, Poirot said gently. Not yet. Not until the murderer believes the trap is working. The guilty party must feel safe. They must believe suspicion points elsewhere. Durley stared, bewildered. Poirot smiled faintly. We allow the false lead to stand, for now. That afternoon, we walked through the village green, autumn leaves turning to copper around us. Poirot walked more slowly than usual, his hands behind his back, gaze lifted toward the ancient clock tower. What are you thinking, Poirot? I asked. That the murderer is intelligent, careful, someone who understands the psychology of guilt and blame. And you know who it is? He smiled, but not in triumph, in sorrow. I know what they fear. That is enough for now. Then his expression hardened, focused. For tonight, Hastings, we must watch. There will be movement. Someone will act. Because they believe James Whitcomb has taken the blame. I shivered despite the evening warmth. And when they act, Poirot murmured, they shall reveal themselves. Night descended early over Belfry on the Weald, the autumn twilight fading into a cool, mist-laden darkness. The clock tower stood outlined against the sky like the shadow of some ancient sentinel, its bells silent now, almost ominously so. The village lanes were empty. Even the dogs did not bark. An air of suspended breath hung everywhere. Poirot, however, was invigorated. Now, Hastings, he said as we returned to the Rose and Heather Inn after dusk. We play the most delicate of games. We do not chase the murderer. We let the murderer chase the certainty of their victory. He was in that strange state I had observed in a handful of our most difficult cases, calm, almost serene, yet intensely alive behind the eyes. A cat before the leap. You believe the murderer will act again tonight? I said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. A person who has committed one murder, Hastings, and believes he has been successful. That person grows confident. But a person who fears the crime will be uncovered, that one becomes desperate. He paused, tapping a fingertip lightly against his temple. And desperation creates error. We returned to the inn's morning room, where the remaining suspects had gathered at Poirot's invitation. A fire crackled warmly, providing a strange contrast to the tension that coiled through the room. Mrs. Millicent Gray sat upright, lips tight, gloves still on, though no one else wore theirs. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was composed, but pale. Reverend Penn clasped his hands tightly, as if in silent pleading. Colonel Ashworth paced like a caged animal. Poirot stood near the hearth, hands folded neatly before him. My friends, he began, it is believed by some, here he cast a gentle glance toward the colonel, that the unfortunate death of Monsieur Selby is solved, that we have our culprit. A ripple passed through the group, anger, relief, fear, each in different measure. Poirot's tone remained pleasant. But I, Hercule Poirot, am not so easily satisfied. Mrs. Gray exhaled sharply. Must we continue to revisit this dreadful event? Surely the police are handling matters now. Poirot smiled with exquisite mildness. Madame, a murderer remains among us. Would you not wish them found? Her eyes flicked, just briefly, toward Miss Whitcomb. Interesting. Poirot continued now in a tone of gentle conversation, though I could see the threads being placed with deliberate precision. It is curious, is it not, how each of you was touched by Monsieur Selby's work. His reviews of inheritance records affected the Whitcomb estate. His decisions influenced Madame Gray's financial holdings. He consulted the colonel regarding old land rights, and to the Reverend, Selby confided fear of being targeted. The Reverend's head lifted, startled. The colonel stopped pacing. Eleanor Whitcomb's fingers tightened around her teacup. Poirot allowed silence to settle like dust. All of you, he said softly, had reason to wish Monsieur Selby's inquiries to end. The air tightened like a drawn wire. Poirot then moved to the key moment. And yet, the method of death was not one of rage or impulsiveness. He gestured delicately toward the unseen clock tower. No, the bell was struck. The rope was cleanly cut. The body was placed. Someone wished to send a message. Mrs. Gray's gloved hand trembled. The Colonel's jaw clenched. The Reverend's lips moved in silent prayer. Eleanor Whitcomb inhaled once, slowly, then stilled. Poirot watched them, not their faces, but their stillness. Someone in this room had just realized that Poirot understood them. He spoke again, quieter now. Only one of you knew the clock striking 6 during the evening hours held meaning to the village. A superstition that the 6th hour, once past, must not be rung again. I felt a prickle across my skin. The villagers' hesitancy, the tension when the bell had rung. That had been the message. A message only someone raised among them would know the weight of. Miss Whitcomb closed her eyes. Poirot's gaze, however, did not rest on her, but shifted, by degrees, to the Reverend. Reverend Penn paled. "Your family," Poirot said gently, "has kept the clock tower for 3 generations, has it not?" There was a collective inhale. The Reverend drew a trembling breath. "Yes," he whispered. "My father before me, and his father." Poirot nodded, not accusing, merely placing facts in order. "You knew the bell's meanings. You knew how to access the tower without being seen. You knew the mechanism, and Monsieur Selby confided in you. He told you he feared someone, that he had discovered something dangerous." The Reverend's hands shook, but Poirot was not finished. "And yet," he continued softly, "I do not think you killed him." The Reverend's breath caught in shock. The others stared. Poirot turned slowly, deliberately, to Colonel Ashworth. "You knew Selby was close to exposing something very old, something tied to land, to ownership, to a debt of honor." The Colonel's face darkened. "Take care, Poirot." Poirot did not step back. "You were the last man to speak to Selby the day before his death. You were overheard telling him that some things ought to stay buried, and when the bell rang 6 times, you came running too quickly. You knew what it meant." The Colonel's fists clenched, but Poirot held up one finger. "One thing I do not yet know," he said quietly, "is why." And in that moment, the moment before a man speaks, when guilt rises like a tide about to break, the inn's corridor erupted in footsteps. The door burst open. Inspector Durley stood breathless. "Poirot! Another incident. The bell rope, the new rope, has been cut." Poirot's eyes flashed. "The murderer," he whispered, "has begun to move again." We hurried from the inn and across the village green, the mist swirling around us like a living thing. The clock tower loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the moon-washed sky. As we approached, lantern light flickered near the base. Villagers gathered in frightened clusters, voices hushed, movements cautious, as though the very stones were listening. Inspector Durley met us at the foot of the tower, breathing hard. "The replacement rope we fitted this morning, someone cut it clean through," he said grimly. "Same method, same precision." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then the murderer grows anxious. They strike not to kill, but to erase." Durley frowned. "Erase what?" Poirot stepped past him into the tower entrance. "Evidence, or memory, or fear itself. But come, we look." We ascended the wooden spiral steps slowly, each board creaking beneath our shoes. The lantern's light cast long shadows across the rough stone walls. At the top, the fresh rope dangled uselessly, severed with the same unnerving exactness as the last. Poirot examined the fibers closely, without touching. A sharp blade. Clean control. "No hesitation," he murmured. "Our murderer does not panic. They plan." Durley growled. "Then why cut it again? There was no seed." Poirot did not answer immediately. He looked outward through the arched opening where the bell hung suspended, motionless. The bell struck 6. A forbidden hour, he said. Someone wished to warn. Now they wished to silence that warning. I shivered, though the night was still. Poirot turned suddenly. "Inspector Hastings, we descend." His tone told me something had just clicked. When we stepped outside, the crowd parted instinctively. Poirot surveyed the faces, the lamplight flickering over them, fear, suspicion, and something else, guilt in motion. But Poirot did not announce anything. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Madame Whitcomb," he said, spotting Eleanor at the edge of the crowd. "A moment, s'il vous plaît." She came forward, posture straight, face drawn but steady. Poirot's voice was soft. "Your nephew, James. Where is he now?" Eleanor hesitated. "Not long, but a heartbeat too long." "He is still being held by the police, is he not?" she said. Poirot studied her. "You're anxious for him?" "Of course," she replied. "He is my family." Poirot's gaze moved to the colonel, who stood rigidly behind her, jaw clenched, arms folded. Watching her, or guarding her. There was something there, something binding them, unseen but palpable. Poirot pivoted. "Mrs. Gray," he called. She stepped forward reluctantly, her gloves still on, though her hands trembled within them. "You are frightened," Poirot said simply. "Yes," she admitted. "And so is everyone." Poirot shook his head. "Not everyone." His eyes slid toward Reverend Penn. The Reverend stood apart, face shadowed, expression anguished. Poirot approached him gently. "You knew the significance of the 6th toll. You understood the symbolism, and yet you have spoken no word of its meaning." The Reverend's breath caught. His voice, when it came, was low and heavy. "Because it is not merely superstition," he whispered. "It is history." The crowd leaned closer. "The bell was struck 6 times once before," the Reverend continued, voice trembling. "Long ago. During the land dispute that nearly divided the village, it was a warning, an appeal for mercy, before a family was destroyed." Poirot nodded. "And that old dispute is precisely the matter Monsieur Selby was examining." A collective realization rippled through the air. Selby had not been uncovering legal trivialities. He had been untangling ancestral grievance. Poirot turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Colonel Ashworth. "Colonel," he said softly, "your land, your estate, was once part of the Whitcomb holdings. The transfer occurred under questionable terms." Ashworth stiffened. "My father won those rights in honorable negotiation." Poirot's eyes were sharp now, glinting like polished glass. "Or perhaps, Colonel, he took them when the Whitcombs were unable to defend their claim, a humiliation never forgotten, a bitterness never erased." Eleanor Whitcomb's eyes filled with tears, silent, contained, devastating. Poirot continued. "Arthur Selby discovered proof, documents, testimony, something concrete that the land was wrongfully taken. Proof that would return the estate to the Whitcombs and destroy the Ashworth name." The Colonel's fists clenched, his jaw worked. "And Selby intended to bring it to the public record," Poirot finished. Silence. Then, the Colonel's voice, low, strangled. "You do not understand. You cannot understand. That land, my family, our history, everything we are." Poirot raised one quiet hand. "I understand, Colonel. Truly, to lose land is to lose legacy, to lose self, but to take a life to prevent that loss—" The Colonel's eyes flashed. "I didn't kill him." Poirot fell utterly still. The crowd froze. And then Poirot said, Colonel Ashworth's eyes had flickered. Not long, not dramatically, but enough. a glance that revealed allegiance, fear, and a history older than any of us in that square realized. But Poirot did not press him. Not yet. He merely inclined his head, and that gentle pause carried more force than any accusation. The villagers looked from the colonel to Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, who now stood motionless beneath the lantern glow. Her face was composed as ever, but the stillness was different now, less dignity, more resignation. Poirot stepped toward her with quiet, grave respect. "Miss Whitcomb," he said softly, "someone in your family acted to protect you, and to protect what you believe you are owed. But the truth is not yet spoken in full." Eleanor's breath trembled only once, but it was enough. She faltered, not theatrically, just a small, nearly imperceptible weakening of her posture. It was like watching a pillar lean 1 degree too far. Reverend Penn stepped forward at once, as if to steady her. "Eleanor," he whispered, "you must not bear this alone." Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, pride, and memory. Poirot lifted a finger. "No," he said gently. "Miss Whitcomb did not kill Arthur Selby. She confronted him, perhaps pleaded with him, but she did not commit the act. The murderer is someone close to her, someone who feared her suffering even more than losing himself." He turned, not to the colonel, not to the reverend, but to the quietest figure present, James Whitcomb, escorted by Inspector Durley, who had arrived with him moments before. James stood pale, eyes widened, face strained. The lantern light revealed the exhaustion etched deep beneath his skin. He had been brought from the holding cell upon Poirot's request moments earlier, but had stood unnoticed behind the crowd's shifting movements. Poirot spoke with a nearly tragic softness. "James." James swallowed hard. "I told you," he said hoarsely. "I didn't kill him." Poirot nodded. "No, you did not." The crowd exhaled, confused. Poirot continued, every word precise. "But you know who did." A tremor ran through James's entire frame. His hands moved to his temples, pressing, as though trying to keep something from breaking out. The colonel stiffened, grim, bracing. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she did not speak. Mrs. Gray looked away sharply. Reverend Penn closed his eyes. James' voice came out broken. He was going to ruin her. He pointed with a shaking hand. Not at Eleanor, but at the Reverend. Her reputation, her family name, everything she has worked for, everything that kept us alive when the village turned on us. Selby said he would release the report publicly, that there would be no remaining Whitcombs after he was done. He meant to destroy us. Poirot said nothing, allowing the confession to unwind naturally. James' breath shuddered like a man drowning. "I begged him," he whispered. "I begged him to revise his findings. He refused. He said the truth must be honored." Poirot nodded slowly. And someone overheard this conversation. James's gaze slid toward Reverend Penn. The Reverend's eyes opened. There was no denial, only sorrow. Poirot spoke with immense gentleness. Reverend Penn loved the Whitcomb family, not with passion, not with greed, but with loyalty, with inheritance of duty. The Clocktower is and always has been a Whitcomb trust, maintained by the church. To the Reverend, the Whitcombs and the village history are inseparable. Reverend Penn bowed his head. He did not speak. Poirot continued, voice quiet and inexorable. "You confronted Selby in the tower. You asked him to reconsider. He refused, perhaps harshly. And when he moved past you on the stair, perhaps you reached out, perhaps he stumbled. The moment was small, but the consequences irrevocable." A horrified whisper rippled through the crowd. Poirot's voice deepened, not condemning, but mournful. "The bell rope. You cut it afterward. You struck the forbidden hour, not as a taunt, but as a lament, a plea to the past, a cry for old wrongs to remain buried." The Reverend finally spoke, barely more than breath. I could not let the village tear itself apart again. The dispute once destroyed families. I could not watch it happen once more. Eleanor took a step toward him, but he lifted a hand. No, he murmured. I did this. I who was tasked to preserve peace. I who failed. Poirot bowed his head, not in triumph, but in respect for tragedy. Inspector Durley moved a step forward, but Poirot held up one hand. One moment, Inspector. There is one more truth that must be spoken. The Reverend looked up, eyes hollow. Poirot's final words fell like the quiet toll of a bell. You did not kill Selby by accident. A stunned silence. Poirot continued, voice low. You intended to stop him, but you did not mean to kill him. The death came in the struggle, and afterward you staged the scene to send a message only. The villagers would understand. Reverend Penn closed his eyes and nodded once. Yes. Eleanor whispered his name through tears, but there was no collapse, no outcry, only the slow acceptance of a heavy, inherited sorrow. We reconvened in the morning room of the Rose and Heather Inn, though the word room felt too small for the gravity contained within it. The fire burned low. The curtains remained drawn. A profound stillness lay over the air, as though the entire village held its breath. Reverend Penn sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes lowered, yet not in defeat, more in reflection. Inspector Durley stood behind him, grim and steady, awaiting the formalities of custody. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb was motionless, seated upright but hollow-eyed, as if something vital within her had cracked. James stood nearby, guilt written stark across his features. The colonel paced once, then stood with military stillness behind Eleanor. Mrs. Gray lingered at the edge of the room, gloves twisted together. Poirot took his time. He adjusted the flowers on the mantel. He straightened the chair nearest the hearth. He poured himself a cup of tea, precisely 2/3 full. Only then did he speak. You wish to understand, he said softly, how I knew. He looked up, not triumphantly, but with the quiet dignity of a man bearing truth rather than wielding it. Very well. Let us speak of the little things, for murder, mes amis, is always composed of them. The first clue. The clean hands. Arthur Selby's hands were clean, Poirot began. The Clocktower steps, the bell platform, covered in dust. Any man climbing them would have that dust on his palms. Yet Selby did not. James swallowed. Because he didn't climb them of his own accord. Poirot nodded. Just so. He was not the one to ascend the tower. He was either escorted, supported, or placed. This eliminated the possibility of accident immediately. Inspector Durley shifted uncomfortably. Poirot continued. And who would know how to lift or guide a man safely, or as safely as possible, up those narrow and decayed steps? His gaze moved to the Reverend, the caretaker of the tower, the only man who ascends it weekly. The Reverend bowed his head. The second clue, the rope. At first, one might mistake the cutting of the bell rope for violence, but the cut was precise, not hurried. There was no fraying, no sawing. One stroke. Poirot lifted his teacup gently. This indicated a calm hand, a tool sharpened, a knowledge of exactly where to cut so the weight of the bell would not cause injury when it dropped from tension. He looked to the colonel. You, Colonel Ashworth, own many hunting and field knives, but your grip is forceful. The cut rope did not show the force of a soldier. It showed the steadiness of a habit. Reverend Penn nodded faintly. I trim the rope ends each spring, to prevent drying and fray. Poirot inclined his head. Just so. The third clue, the 6 strikes. The villagers spoke of the superstition, the forbidden 6th hour, yet only one person here understood its origin, not as rumor, but as history. Poirot walked to the window and drew back the curtain slightly. The clock tower stood across the square, silent now, but still heavy with memory. The 6 tolls were not a call to attention. They were a lament, a signal once used to plead for mercy during the old land dispute of this village. It was a message meant only for those who knew its meaning. Miss Whitcomb whispered, voice barely audible. The Reverend's family kept that tradition. They preserved it. Poirot nodded. Not superstition, remembrance. The final clue. Motive. Poirot returned to the hearth. Arthur Selby discovered documents proving the Whitcomb's estate had been wrongfully seized generations ago. This truth would return the land, but would destroy the Ashworth name. That alone might incite violence from some. Colonel Ashworth's face tightened, but he remained silent. But the Reverend... Poirot's voice softened. He feared not scandal. He feared division. The last time this fight arose, lives and livelihoods were lost. Families torn apart. The village itself nearly died. The Reverend looked up at last, pain clear but steady. I could not allow it to happen again, he murmured. Poirot nodded. And so, when Selby refused to delay his findings, you confronted him. Perhaps to plead, perhaps to reason. In the struggle, he fell or was pushed. You do not even fully know, but the moment afterward, that was deliberate. You chose the bell, the symbolism, the warning. The Reverend closed his eyes. One tear, not dramatic but human, escaped. Poirot did not look away. It was not a crime of hatred, it was a crime of fear and of love misapplied. Eleanor rose then, not collapsing into despair, but standing beside the Reverend with quiet dignity. I will speak on his behalf, she said to Inspector Durley, voice steady. I will give testimony to his character. He acted for us, not for greed, not for pride. The Reverend smiled, not in joy, but in peace. That, Poirot said softly, is why I delayed the reveal, to allow truth to walk in on its own feet. Inspector Durley stepped forward at last. Reverend Alistair Penn, I must take you into custody. I understand, the Reverend replied. He stood, slowly, gracefully, and allowed himself to be led. No struggle, no shame, only sorrow and acceptance. Poirot watched him go. The room was silent. Finally, Poirot reached for his hat. Hastings, he said gently, we will take a walk. There is something we must discuss about the nature of justice. His eyes turned toward the clock tower, and about the things a village remembers. That afternoon, the villagers of Belfry on the Weald gathered in the church hall at Poirot's request. The clock tower loomed outside, its bell now silent, its rope removed entirely. The air carried the faint scent of wood polish, old hymn books, and something heavier, anticipation, or perhaps dread. Poirot insisted on the gathering, not for spectacle, but for clarity. He believed the truth, once revealed, should be spoken aloud to all whom it touched. And this truth touched everyone. A long wooden table had been set at the front of the hall. Poirot stood behind it, hands resting gently on its surface. Inspector Durley stood to his left. I sat among the villagers, Hastings by his side as chronicler and witness. The remaining central figures sat before Poirot. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb, pale but composed. James Whitcomb, eyes worn and shadowed, hands folded tightly. Colonel Ashworth, jaw clenched, each breath measured. Mrs. Gray, stiff-backed, her gloves finally removed. Reverend Penn had already been escorted to the police carriage outside, awaiting transfer, but his presence lingered heavily in every heart. Poirot began softly. My friends, we are here not to condemn, but to understand. The death of Monsieur Arthur Selby was not a crime born solely of malice, but of history, of old wounds, long buried but never healed. And such wounds, mes amis, bleed through time. The room was silent. Poirot continued, "Let us begin at the beginning. Monsieur Selby came to Belfry-on-the-Weald as a solicitor, to resolve disputes concerning heritage, land, and ownership. On the surface, simple matters of law, but beneath, there was something more. He paced slowly, his steps measured, rhythmic. Centuries ago, the lands of this village were divided between the Whitcomb family and the Ashworth family, and over time, through misfortune, illness, and financial decline, the Whitcombs lost much of their estate. The Ashworths gained it. But the transfer was not, how do we say, clean. Colonel Ashworth stiffened. Poirot raised a hand, his tone kind rather than accusatory. "I cast no blame, Colonel. The sins of the father are not the sins of the son, but the record, the document, the final deed of legitimacy was missing." James swallowed. "And Monsieur Selby," Poirot said gently, "found it." A wave of quiet shock rippled through the hall. Poirot turned to Eleanor. "Miss Whitcomb, you learned of this discovery, and you understood what it meant. The restoration of your family's standing, the return of land, heritage, identity." Eleanor's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Yes." Poirot nodded. "But you, mademoiselle, are not a woman of violence. You sought only negotiation, persuasion, dignity." His gaze shifted to her nephew. "However, James, you feared far more." James closed his eyes. Shame trembled through every line of him. Poirot continued, his voice never cruel. "You feared losing her, the last of your family's legacy, the last source of pride she possessed. So when Monsieur Selby refused to delay the release of his findings, when he insisted the record be made public immediately, you felt desperation, but you did not strike him." James lifted his tear-filled gaze. "No," he whispered. "I only argued. I begged. He walked away from me." Poirot nodded, and someone else overheard. He turned to the crowd, not a single person, but the shared memory of the village. The Reverend Penn. He heard the raised voices. He understood what Selby's discovery meant, not legally, but emotionally, historically, spiritually. Poirot's voice deepened, becoming profoundly gentle. He had seen what such disputes can do to a community. He had seen the Whitcombs suffer enough. He believed, in his heart, that to reveal this truth now would destroy lives. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. So he followed Selby, perhaps not to murder, but to persuade, to beg even. Up the narrow tower stairs, words led to anger, anger to movement, movement to the fatal fall. A murmur, soft collective grief. Poirot continued, his hands now clasped. The cutting of the rope, the striking of the 6 forbidden chimes. These were not the actions of a man concealing guilt. They were the actions of a man asking the past to bear witness, a lament, a warning, a plea. Inspector Durley bowed his head. Even he could not deny the humility of the act. Poirot's voice gentled into finality. The Reverend Penn is responsible, but not as a villain, as a man who carried too heavy a burden and chose in a moment of terrible sorrow the wrong way to protect what he loved. He stepped back from the table, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Justice will be done, but compassion must accompany it. For murder, Hastings, he looked to me, is never merely an act. It is a story of hearts misled." The villagers absorbed his words, not with outrage, but with quiet, solemn understanding. And in that hall, beneath the wooden beams that had witnessed generations of grief and grace, the old wound finally began to close. The morning of our departure arrived shrouded in a mist that softened the outlines of Belfry-on-the-Weald, until it seemed less a place of stone and earth and more a memory suspended in the air. The church bell did not toll. It would remain silent until a new rope was fitted, and even then I suspected the villagers would listen to it differently than before. Poirot stood near the gate outside the Rose and Heather Inn, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his valise packed precisely, every crease and corner orderly. Mrs. Creswick hovered nearby, her expression troubled but respectful. The entire village had changed. Conversations quieted, glances softened, and the weight of what had occurred hung, gently, not heavily, over the streets. Reverend Penn had been taken to the county jail, not in irons, not with hostility, but with solemnity. The villagers lined the lane as he passed, not to condemn him, but to walk beside him, as one bears a coffin or a shared sorrow. Miss Eleanor Whitcomb had not returned to her ancestral house. She remained with Mrs. Gray that night, and by morning she seemed older, not aged by years, but refined by grief. Colonel Ashworth had left at dawn, his hat pulled low, his stride stiff. Whether he fled shame or reflection, I could not say. James Whitcomb, pale and shaken but free of suspicion, approached us before we left. He stood in front of Poirot, voice quiet but steady. "I owe you my freedom," he said. Poirot shook his head gently. "Non, monsieur. You owe your freedom to truth. I merely revealed what you already knew within yourself." James swallowed. "Will Reverend Penn—" Poirot placed a hand lightly on the young man's shoulder. "The law will judge him, but the law is not blind to intent, and you, James, must ensure that the purpose of his sacrifice, however tragic its form, does not become meaningless. The village must not fall into division once again." James nodded, though his eyes glimmered with tears. Poirot released him. "Your task is to heal, not to repay. Go, care for your aunt. Care for your home." As James walked away, Poirot watched him with a gaze full of something I could not immediately name. It was not pity, nor was it sorrow. It was understanding. We boarded the small motor coach that would take us to the nearest rail stop. As the vehicle pulled away, the clock tower came into view once more, the ancient stone rising above the mist, solemn, enduring. I glanced at Poirot. "You're quiet," I said softly. Poirot kept his eyes fixed upon the tower. "There are murders, Hastings," he said, "that cry out of greed or rage or jealousy. Those are simple murders. Straightforward. The murderer wants something, he takes it, and justice is the balancing of the scales." The wheels rattled on the uneven road. "But there are other murders," Poirot continued, voice subdued, "that are born not of hatred, but of love, of a misguided wish to protect, to preserve, to hold back the tide of change." He folded his gloves precisely and placed them in his coat pocket. "In such cases, justice is no longer simply the law. It is the careful weighing of the human soul." I listened quietly. Poirot went on. "Reverend Penn did not desire to kill. He desired to prevent harm, but harm, Hastings, cannot be prevented through violence. Violence creates echoes. The bell tolls not for warning, but for requiem." The mist thinned just enough to reveal fields stretching outward, dotted with sheep and hedgerows. The countryside seemed unchanged, and yet everything had changed. Poirot leaned back slightly. "The village will heal. Slowly, with silence and reflection. They will speak of Reverend Penn not as a monster, but as a man who carried too much history on his shoulders, and that, I think, is the truest justice he could have hoped for." We rode in thoughtful quiet for a long while. At last, Poirot spoke again, but this time lightly, with a familiar spark returning to his eyes. "And now, Hastings, I believe we deserve a small holiday. Something simple, something relaxing. Perhaps a seaside promenade, with proper pastries." I laughed, relieved to hear levity return. "Anywhere in particular?" Poirot gave one of his serene yet mischievous smiles. "Anywhere," he said, "so long as there are no clock towers." The motor coach turned the bend, and Belfry on the wheel disappeared behind the crest of the hill. Its secrets now quiet, its wounds beginning to mend, its bell waiting for the day when it might ring again without sorrow. And thus we departed. Poirot immaculate, composed and thoughtful as ever, carrying with us the memory of a village, a tragedy, and the silence beneath the clock tower.